October 2023. A cramped antique shop in downtown Philadelphia. Daniel Torres, a 28-year-old photography enthusiast, runs his fingers along a shelf crowded with forgotten relics. Dusty typewriters, tarnished silverware, boxes of yellowed postcards from people long dead. He's looking for vintage cameras, his weekend hobby, his escape from the monotony of his data analyst job. The shop smells of old paper and wood polish. Rain patters against the front window. It's one of those gray Saturday afternoons where the city feels simultaneously bustling and melancholy. Daniel has been collecting vintage cameras for 3 years now, ever since his grandfather passed away and left him a Leica from the 1950s. There's something about these mechanical marvels, these devices that captured moments before digital sensors and memory cards existed, that fascinates him. The weight of them, the clicking of the shutter, the anticipation of not knowing what images might be preserved inside. And then he sees it. A Kodak Instamatic 104, olive green casing scratched and faded. $19, the price tag says, though the seller seems willing to negotiate. Daniel picks it up, feels its weight, and something makes him pause. The film advance lever is stuck in mid-position. There's film inside. 52-year-old film, if the camera's age is any indication. He turns it over in his hands. The camera is heavier than he expected. There's a small dent on one corner, a scratch across the viewfinder. But it's the film that intrigues him most. In all his years of collecting, he's rarely found cameras with film still loaded. Most people removed the film decades ago, developed it, kept the memories, or threw them away. But this film has been sitting in this camera for over half a century, undisturbed, waiting. He buys it for $15. The shopkeeper, an elderly woman with wire-rimmed glasses, wraps it in newspaper. She mentions something about an estate sale, boxes of old things nobody wanted. Daniel nods politely, already thinking about where he'll send the film for development. There are only a handful of labs in the country that can handle film this old. The chemicals degrade. The emulsion becomes brittle. But if anyone can recover the images, it's the specialists at ArcLight Film Labs in Brooklyn. 3 weeks later, after sending that film to one of the only labs in the country that specializes in developing decades-old exposures, Daniel receives an email. The subject line reads, "You need to see this." Attached is a single photograph. Frame 24 of 26. Taken on October 17, 1971, at approximately 6:45 in the evening. In that photograph is a family. A father, a mother, 3 children. They're seated at a dinner table, smiling at the camera, frozen in what should have been an ordinary Sunday evening. But in the background, partially obscured by shadow, standing in a doorway that leads to the basement, is another figure. A man, dark coveralls, face turned just slightly away from the lens. A man who shouldn't be there. A man who, according to every piece of evidence collected over 5 decades, didn't exist. But here's what makes this photograph extraordinary. What makes it the key to one of the most baffling disappearances in American history. That family, the Hendersons of Millbrook, Pennsylvania, vanished that very night. All 5 of them. Between the moment this photograph was taken and the moment the pot roast on their stove burned dry, they ceased to exist. No bodies. No witnesses. No explanation. Until now. What you're about to hear is the complete story of the Henderson family disappearance. And I need to warn you, the truth that emerged from that camera, the truth that was buried for 52 years, is darker than anyone imagined. By the end of this story, you'll understand why a single photograph, taken automatically by a timer, haunted investigators for decades. You'll understand why 5 people vanished from a locked house during dinner. And you'll understand why sometimes the worst monsters are the ones who show up at the wrong address. Before we dive into this story, if you're fascinated by mysteries like this, true crime cases that defy explanation until that one crucial piece of evidence surfaces, make sure you're subscribed to Ultimate Crime Stories. We bring you the most compelling, meticulously researched cases, the ones that keep you awake at night wondering how something like this could happen. Hit that subscribe button now, because we've got more stories that will absolutely grip you. Let's go back. October 17, 1971. Millbrook, Pennsylvania. Millbrook was the kind of town where people didn't lock their doors. Population, 3,200. One main street with a hardware store, a diner, a small library, and a five and dime that sold everything from penny candy to fishing lures. The kind of place where everyone knew everyone, where the biggest excitement was Friday night high school football, where the worst crime in recent memory was when Tommy Bradshaw's older brother spray-painted his initials on the water tower in '68. It was a kind of American small town that seemed frozen in time, insulated from the chaos of a larger world. While protests raged in cities, while the Vietnam War dominated national consciousness, while the country seemed to be tearing itself apart, Millbrook remained quiet, peaceful, safe, or so everyone thought. The town sat in a valley surrounded by rolling hills covered in oak and maple trees. In October, those hills blazed with autumn colors, reds and oranges and yellows that looked like fire against the gray sky. Main Street had American flags hanging from lampposts. The diner, Rosie's, served coffee for a dime and had a jukebox that still played songs from the 50s. The hardware store was run by Mr. Peterson, who'd inherited it from his father and knew every customer by name. This was a town where children rode their bikes until the streetlights came on, where neighbors borrowed cups of sugar and returned them with fresh-baked cookies. Where the biggest scandal was when Mrs. O'Brien's husband was seen having coffee with his secretary at Rosie's Diner. It was, in every sense, the kind of place where nothing bad was supposed to happen. The Henderson family lived on Maple Street, a quiet residential road lined with oak trees and modest two-story homes built in the 1920s. Number 42 Maple Street. A white house with green shutters, a small front porch, and a chain-link fence around the backyard where their dog, a golden retriever named Biscuit, would bark at squirrels. The house itself was typical for the neighborhood. 2 stories, 3 bedrooms upstairs, a living room and dining room on the first floor, and a basement that still had the original coal furnace from when the house was built. The Hendersons had painted the exterior white just that summer, and Margaret had planted chrysanthemums along the front walk, their bronze and yellow blooms adding color to the October landscape. Inside, the house was neat but lived in. Family photos on the mantel. Sarah's homework papers spread across the dining room table most evenings. Tommy's baseball equipment cluttering the mudroom. Baby toys scattered across the living room floor. It was a home full of life, full of the ordinary chaos that comes with raising 3 children. Robert Henderson was 42 years old. He taught chemistry and physics at Millbrook High School, and by every account, he was the kind of teacher students remembered fondly years later. Patient, enthusiastic, the type who'd stay after school to help a struggling student understand kinetic energy or balance a chemical equation. He wore short-sleeved button-down shirts with thin ties, had thick-framed glasses, and kept his dark hair neatly combed. On weekends, his passion was photography. He had a small darkroom set up in the basement where he'd develop his own film, documenting every family milestone, every birthday, every ordinary Tuesday that he wanted to remember. Robert had discovered photography in college. It started as a way to make extra money, taking portraits for other students. But it became something more, a way of seeing the world, of preserving moments that would otherwise be lost to time. He documented everything. Margaret laughed at him sometimes, called him obsessive. But she loved that he wanted to remember every detail of their lives together. His darkroom was his sanctuary. He'd spend hours down there on Saturday mornings, developing film, making prints, the red safe light casting everything in an eerie glow. He taught Tommy the basics, showed him how to load film, how to adjust exposure. Sarah sometimes joined them, taking notes for potential stories she wanted to write. Photography wasn't just Robert's hobby. It was how he connected with his family, how he showed his love. Margaret Henderson, 39, worked part-time at the Millbrook Public Library, shelving books and helping patrons find what they needed. She volunteered with the church auxiliary, organized bake sales, and according to her sister Eleanor, made the best pot roast in 3 counties. She had strawberry blonde hair that she wore in a neat bob, and she had this habit of humming while she cooked, usually hymns from Sunday service. Margaret was the kind of woman everyone in town knew and liked. She had a warmth about her, a genuine interest in other people's lives. At the library, she remembered what books patrons enjoyed, would set aside new arrivals she thought they might like. At church, she organized the annual Christmas pageant, somehow managing to wrangle dozens of children into something resembling order. She baked pies for neighbors who were sick, volunteered at the school bake sales, and never had an unkind word to say about anyone. She'd grown up in Millbrook, had married Robert right after he finished college. They'd bought the house on Maple Street with help from her parents, had planned to fill it with children and laughter and love. And they had. Margaret sometimes thought about how blessed she was. A good husband, 3 healthy children, a home, a community, everything she'd ever wanted. Their oldest child, Sarah, was 16, honor roll student, editor of the school newspaper, and according to her best friend, Julie Chun, annoyingly perfect. Sarah wanted to be a journalist. She kept notebooks full of story ideas, interviewed her teachers for practice articles, and dreamed of working for a big city newspaper someday. She had her mother's blonde hair and her father's serious brown eyes. Sarah was at that age where she was caught between childhood and adulthood. She still slept with her childhood teddy bear, but wore makeup and worried about boys. She argued with her parents about her curfew, but still asked her mother to braid her hair. She was brilliant, driven, curious about everything. Her teachers said she asked too many questions. Her father said there was no such thing. She'd recently been accepted as editor of the school newspaper, a position usually reserved for seniors. She took it seriously, staying after school to work on layouts, interviewing students and teachers, writing editorials about school policy changes. She kept a journal filled with observations about people, snippets of overheard conversations, ideas for stories. Someday, she told Julie, she'd work for the New York Times or the Washington Post. She'd break important stories. She'd make a difference. Tommy was 12. Little league shortstop, obsessed with magic tricks, and constantly trying to convince his parents to let him get a pet snake. He collected baseball cards and kept them in a shoebox under his bed, organized by team and player statistics he'd memorized. His teachers said he struggled to sit still, but had a sharp mind for math. Tommy was all energy and enthusiasm. He couldn't walk anywhere. He had to run. He talked constantly, asked endless questions, drove Sarah crazy by barging into her room without knocking. He practiced magic tricks in the mirror, determined to master the sleight of hand he'd seen on TV. His baseball coach said he had potential, real talent, if he could just learn to focus. He worshipped his father, followed him around on weekends, helped with yard work, asked questions about everything. Why was the sky blue? How did cameras work? What made the leaves change color? Robert answered every question patiently, sometimes pulling out encyclopedias to show Tommy diagrams and explanations. Tommy absorbed it all like a sponge. And then there was Emma, 8 months old, all chubby cheeks and wispy brown hair. She was just starting to pull herself up on furniture, just beginning to babble sounds that might become words. Margaret kept a baby book documenting her milestones. First tooth. First time sleeping through the night. First time eating solid food. Emma was the surprise baby, born when Margaret was 38 and thought she was done having children. But she'd been a gift, a last chance at the baby stage Margaret had missed with Tommy growing up so fast. Emma was an easy baby, quick to smile, rarely fussy. She loved music, would bounce in her high chair when Robert played records. She loved Biscuit, would shriek with laughter when the dog licked her face. This was the Henderson family. Ordinary, beloved, unremarkable, in every way except for what was about to happen to them. Sunday, October 17th, 1971, started like every other Sunday. The Hendersons attended the 10 o'clock service at Millbrook Community Church. Robert sang the hymns off-key, as he always did. Margaret held baby Emma and tried to keep her from grabbing the bulletin. Sarah sat with her friends in the back pew, and Tommy fidgeted until his father gave him that look that meant settle down. The sermon that morning was about gratitude, about being thankful for blessings. Pastor Williams talked about family, about cherishing the time we have together. Margaret reached over and squeezed Robert's hand. They exchanged a smile. After the service, they lingered on the church steps, talking with neighbors. Mrs. Chin mentioned she was having trouble with her gas stove, thought there might be a leak. Margaret suggested she call the utility company first thing Monday morning. After church, they came home. Robert spent the afternoon raking leaves in the backyard while Tommy helped by jumping in the piles. Margaret started preparing dinner around 4 in the afternoon. Pot roast with carrots and potatoes, one of Robert's favorites. Sarah was on the phone in the living room, stretched out on the couch with the cord tangled around her finger, talking to Julie about some boy from school, about homework, about whether or not she should audition for the school play. It was an ordinary Sunday, the kind of day that would be forgotten by Monday, the kind of day that, years later, you couldn't distinguish from any other. Except this Sunday would be remembered forever. This Sunday would become the day the Henderson family ceased to exist. At 6:43 p.m., Margaret called from the kitchen. "Sarah, dinner in 5 minutes." Off the phone. Sarah groaned, told Julie she had to go. "Mom's calling. See you at school tomorrow." Those words. See you at school tomorrow. 8 ordinary words that would haunt Julie Chun for the rest of her life. Because there would be no tomorrow. Not for Sarah. Not for any of them. That was the last time anyone outside the Henderson house heard any of their voices. At 6:45, the family gathered at the dining room table. Margaret had set it with her good china, the set with the blue flowers that had been a wedding gift. 5 place settings. Robert sat at the head of the table. Margaret was bringing the pot roast from the kitchen. Sarah was already seated. Tommy was poking at his younger sister, who was secured in her wooden high chair, bib tied around her neck. The dining room was warm, lit by the overhead light and a small lamp on the sideboard. The windows showed darkness outside, October's early sunset already complete. The smell of pot roast filled the house, savory and comforting. It was, in every way, a perfect family moment. Robert had decided to take a family photo. He did this occasionally, documenting their Sunday dinners. He set his Kodak Instamatic on the sideboard, angled toward the table, and activated the timer. 10 seconds. He walked quickly to his seat. The camera clicked. Frame 23. Everyone smiling. Margaret mid-step from the kitchen, holding the roasting pan. The timer was set to take 2 photos in succession. Robert advanced the film. The family waited for the second click. Frame 24. And then something happened. Something that would erase 5 people from existence. Somewhere in those next few seconds, between the click of frame 24 and the moment Margaret would have set the pot roast on the table, between Sarah reaching for her water glass and Tommy making one more joke to annoy his sister, between the ordinary and the impossible, 5 lives ended. The next morning, Monday, October 18th, Sarah Henderson didn't show up for school. This was unprecedented. Sarah had perfect attendance. She was responsible, punctual, the kind of student who arrived 10 minutes early to class. When she wasn't in homeroom, Julie Chin felt a prickle of worry, but she assumed Sarah was sick. Maybe the flu. She'd call her later. But as the morning progressed, Julie's worry grew. Sarah always called if she was sick. Always. And she'd seemed fine yesterday on the phone. Happy even. Excited about trying out for the school play. Julie tried calling the Henderson house during lunch. No answer. She tried again after school. Still nothing. Robert Henderson didn't show up to teach his first period chemistry class. This was also unprecedented. Robert had taught at Millbrook High for 16 years and had never, not once, missed a day without calling in advance. By 9:30, the principal, Mr. Donovan, tried calling the Henderson residence. No answer. He tried again at 10. Still no answer. Mr. Donovan felt a knot forming in his stomach. This wasn't like Robert. Not at all. He sent his secretary over to the house during her lunch break. She knocked. No answer. The car was in the driveway. The lights were on inside. But no one came to the door. Meanwhile, Mrs. Lily Chun, Julie's mother and the Hendersons' next-door neighbor, was getting worried. She'd noticed that the lights in the Henderson house had been on all night. Not just 1 or 2 lamps, but every light on the first floor. She'd noticed at 11 p.m. when she let her cat out. She'd noticed again at 2 a.m. when she couldn't sleep and looked out her bedroom window. And now, at 10 in the morning, those same lights were still burning. Mrs. Chun knew the Hendersons well. They'd been neighbors for 15 years. She knew their routines, their habits. Robert always turned off the downstairs lights before bed. Always. He was particular about it. Would walk through the house, checking each room. Margaret teased him about it, called him obsessive. But he'd do it anyway, every night without fail. So why were all the lights still on? She walked over, knocked on the front door. No answer. She knocked harder. Called out, "Margaret? Robert? Everything okay?" Nothing. She tried the doorknob. It turned. The door was unlocked. Mrs. Chun hesitated. You didn't just walk into someone's house uninvited, even in Millbrook. But something felt wrong. Deeply wrong. The hair on the back of her neck stood up. Her instincts, honed by 62 years of life, were screaming at her that something was very wrong. She pushed the door open and called out again. "Hello? Anyone home?" The house was silent except for the humming of the refrigerator. The silence itself felt wrong. Even when the family was out, the house had a different quality to it. This silence was heavy, oppressive, like the house itself was holding its breath. She walked through the living room. Nothing seemed disturbed. Magazines on the coffee table. Television turned off. A basket of laundry folded on the couch, waiting to be put away. She continued to the dining room. And that's when she saw it. The dinner table was still set. 5 plates, 5 sets of silverware, 5 glasses of water. But the food had never been served to the plates. The pot roast sat in its pan in the center of a table, dried out. The carrots and potatoes congealed in hardened grease. 5 chairs, all empty. Baby Emma's high chair still had her bib draped over the side. Mrs. Chen's hand went to her mouth. Her heart began to pound. She backed out of the dining room and ran home to call the police. The Millbrook Police Department consisted of Chief Harold Barnes and 4 officers. When they arrived at the Henderson residence at 10:30 a.m., they conducted a thorough search of the house. What they found was both ordinary and deeply disturbing. No signs of forced entry. The back door was locked from the inside. All the windows were latched. The house hadn't been ransacked. Nothing appeared to be stolen. Margaret's purse was on the counter in the kitchen, wallet inside with $43 in cash. Robert's wallet was in the bedroom, money and credit cards untouched. The family car, a 1968 Chevrolet Impala, was parked in the driveway. Keys hanging on the hook by the front door. All of the family's clothing was still in closets and drawers. Toothbrushes in the bathroom. Sarah's homework spread out on her desk. Tommy's baseball glove on his bed. Emma's diapers and bottles in her nursery. 5 people had simply vanished. Chief Barnes had been a police officer for 23 years. He'd seen accidents, domestic disputes, the occasional theft. But he'd never seen anything like this. A family doesn't just disappear from a locked house. It doesn't happen. It can't happen. But here's what made the scene even more unnerving. The pot roast had been cooking. Margaret had taken it out of the oven and brought it to the table. But the table was set, but the food was never served. The plates were empty. This suggested that whatever happened in those few minutes between sitting down and actually beginning to eat. A window of time so narrow it was almost impossible to comprehend. Think about it. The time it takes to sit down at a table, to settle into your chair, to say grace, perhaps, to unfold your napkin, to reach for serving spoons. Maybe 2 minutes. 3 at most. In that impossibly brief window, 5 people vanished without a trace. The police found one more thing. Robert's camera, sitting on the sideboard in the dining room, exactly where he'd placed it for the timer photos. The film advance lever was in mid-position, indicating Robert had advanced the film, but hadn't wound it completely. There was still film in the camera. Chief Barnes bagged the camera as evidence, though at the time, no one quite understood its significance. It was just a camera. Robert was known to take photos constantly. What could it possibly tell them? The investigation began immediately. The FBI was called in within 48 hours because the case involved potential kidnapping of a minor, Actually 3 minors across state lines. Agent Dennis Kowalski took charge, a 20-year veteran with a reputation for thoroughness. Kowalski had worked kidnapping cases before, child abductions, ransom situations, but he'd never encountered anything quite like this. The complete absence of evidence was itself evidence of something. But what? A meticulously planned crime? Or something else entirely? The first theory was abduction. Someone had taken a family, all 5 of them, for reasons unknown. But this theory had problems from the start. Why would someone kidnap an entire family? The Hendersons weren't wealthy. Robert made a teacher's salary, $3,800 a year. Margaret's part-time library work added maybe another $1,200. They had a modest savings account with $2,200. They didn't come from money. They had no connections to organized crime, no enemies that anyone could identify. Agent Kowalski and his team dug deep into the Hendersons' background. They examined bank records, phone records, credit card statements. They interviewed friends, colleagues, extended family. They looked for any connection to criminal activity, any possibility of gambling debts, affairs, secrets. They found nothing. The Hendersons were exactly what they appeared to be. A normal, happy, middle-class family. And if it was kidnapping for ransom, why no ransom note? Why no contact at all? Days passed, then weeks, then months. No demands. No communication. Nothing. The FBI set up a tip line. Posters went up across Pennsylvania and neighboring states. The case made national news. Photos of the Henderson family appeared on the evening news, in newspapers, on bulletin boards. Thousands of tips poured in. Every single one was investigated. Every single one led nowhere. The logistics bothered investigators too. How do you forcibly remove 5 people, including an 8-month-old baby, from a house without any signs of struggle? The dining room showed no evidence of violence. No overturned furniture. No broken dishes. The glasses of water on the table were still upright and full. If someone had attacked the family, wouldn't there be some indication? Wouldn't Margaret have screamed? Wouldn't Robert have fought back? And then there was the timeline. The window of opportunity was impossibly small. Julie Chun had spoken to Sarah at 6:43 p.m. The family was sitting down to dinner at approximately 6:45. Mrs. Chun looked out her window around 7:15 and saw all the lights on, but noticed nothing unusual, no vehicles, no commotion. By the time the family was discovered missing the next morning, they'd been gone for over 15 hours. But they'd only been missing from sight for maybe 30 to 45 minutes before Mrs. Chun would have noticed anything amiss. The second theory was darker. Had Robert Henderson snapped? Had he killed his family and then disappeared? It sounds unthinkable, but investigators have to consider every possibility, and family annihilators, though rare, do exist. Agent Kowalski had seen it before. Seemingly normal men who suddenly murdered their entire families. Usually there were warning signs, financial stress, mental illness, marital problems. But sometimes there weren't. Sometimes people just snapped. They looked into Robert's background exhaustively. Talked to colleagues, friends, extended family. Everyone said the same thing. Robert was gentle, kind, patient. He adored his wife and children. No one had ever seen him raise his voice, let alone his hand. No history of mental illness. No financial troubles that might have driven him to desperation. No affairs, no secrets, no hidden darkness. Margaret's sister Eleanor was adamant. Robert would rather die than hurt Margaret or those kids. This is ridiculous. His colleagues at the school were equally baffled by the suggestion. The principal, Mr. Donovan, said, "Robert Henderson is the last person on earth I'd suspect of violence. He wouldn't hurt a fly. Literally. I once saw him carefully capture a wasp that flew into his classroom and release it outside rather than kill it." And again, the logistics made no sense. If Robert had killed his family, where were the bodies? The house was searched top to bottom. The yard was searched. Cadaver dogs were brought in and found nothing. The surrounding woods were combed by volunteers, grid by grid, for weeks. Nothing. And if Robert had disposed of his family's bodies somewhere else, how? The car was in the driveway. He would have needed to transport 4 bodies, including his own wife, who would have resisted, all in the narrow window of time before anyone noticed. It was virtually impossible. The third theory came much later, mostly from internet sleuths in the 2000s. Witness protection. Government conspiracy. Some suggested Robert had been a secret government operative, that the family had been relocated for their safety, that the whole disappearance was staged. These theories gained traction online, particularly after the case was featured on several true crime shows in the 1990s. Forums dedicated to unsolved mysteries dissected every detail. Some pointed to Robert's science background, suggested he might have been working on classified projects. Others noted the timing, October 1971, and drew connections to various Cold War conspiracies. The FBI denied this categorically. Robert Henderson was a high school chemistry teacher. Period. No classified work. No connections to intelligence agencies. No reason whatsoever for the government to intervene in his life. And even if this wild theory were true, why stage it so badly? Why leave dinner on the table? Why not create a more believable cover story? Agent Kowalski called these theories desperate attempts to impose logic on something that defies it. The truth, he believed, was simpler and darker. But without evidence, without bodies, without any concrete leads, he had nothing to work with. By the end of 1971, the Henderson case was national news. Photos of the family appeared on milk cartons and telephone poles. Age-progressed images were created showing what Sarah and Tommy might look like as they grew older. Tips poured in from across the country. Someone saw a woman who looked like Margaret in Texas. Someone saw a man who looked like Robert in California. A girl matching Sarah's description was spotted in Florida. Every single tip was investigated. Every single one led nowhere. The years passed. The case went cold. By 1976, active investigation had mostly ceased. By 1980, the case was officially classified as cold. By 1990, it was a footnote in true crime books, one of those mysteries that seemed unsolvable, one of those cases that haunted people who read about it but offered no answers. Agent Kowalski retired in 1985. The Henderson case was his one failure, the one that got away. He kept the case files in his home office, would occasionally pull them out and review them, looking for something he'd missed. He never found it. He died in 2003, still wondering what had happened to that family. The house on Maple Street, after sitting empty for 7 years, was finally sold in 1978 to a young couple from Pittsburgh who knew nothing of its history. They raised their own children there. Life went on. The new owners occasionally heard whispers, neighbors mentioning what happened here, but no one ever gave them details. They assumed someone had died in the house, maybe an old owner who'd lived there for decades. They never imagined the truth. The evidence from the case, boxes and boxes of it, sat in storage at the Millbrook Police Department. Interview transcripts, photographs of the scene, financial records, and Robert Henderson's camera, film still inside, sitting in an evidence bag, forgotten. Because here's the thing. In 1971, developing that film seemed pointless. What could it possibly show? The family sitting at dinner? Everyone knew they'd been sitting at dinner. The crime scene photos already documented the table, the empty plates, the dried-out pot roast. What could Robert's personal photos add to the investigation? And so the film was never developed. The camera sat in its evidence bag for 52 years, until Daniel Torres bought it at an estate sale. Let's talk about how that happened. In 2015, the Millbrook Police Department conducted a massive evidence purge. Cases more than 40 years old that were officially closed or cold were reviewed. Anything that was no longer needed for active investigation or legal proceedings was to be disposed of or returned to families. The Henderson case files were reviewed. The case was still technically open, but there had been no activity in decades. Most of the physical evidence was deemed unnecessary to retain. A distant relative, Margaret Henderson's nephew, Richard Calloway, was contacted. Richard had been 12 years old when his aunt disappeared. He was now 56. He agreed to take possession of some of the family belongings that had been held in evidence. Among these items, photograph albums, some of Robert's personal effects, and his camera. Richard kept these items in his attic for 8 years. He never looked through them. They were too painful, reminders of an aunt he barely remembered, and a tragedy he'd grown up hearing about. His mother, Margaret's sister Eleanor, had never gotten over the disappearance. She died in 2008, still not knowing what had happened to her sister. Richard had inherited her grief, her unanswered questions, her pain. When Richard's wife suggested they downsize in 2023, he decided to sell everything at an estate sale. He wanted nothing to do with the Henderson legacy. He wanted to be free of the weight of unanswered questions, of the family tragedy that had cast a shadow over his entire life. The estate sale was held on a rainy Saturday in September 2023. Daniel Torres, camera collector, was browsing. He saw the Kodak Instamatic, picked it up, noticed the film inside. The seller, Richard's wife, said she had no idea what was on the film, had no idea of the camera's history. Daniel bought it. Daniel took the camera home, excited at the prospect of developing decades-old film. But he knew he couldn't do it himself. Film that old requires specialized processing. The chemicals degrade. The emulsion becomes fragile. One wrong step and the images are destroyed forever. He contacted ArcLight Film Labs in Brooklyn, one of the few places in the country that specializes in vintage and damaged film restoration. He mailed the camera, along with detailed instructions and a rather large check. The cost for developing 50-year-old film was significant, but Daniel didn't care. This was his passion. These forgotten images, these preserved moments, were worth any price. While he waited, Daniel did what any curious person would do. He researched the camera. He found the serial number engraved on the bottom. On a whim, he Googled it. And that's when he found it. A digitized police evidence log from the Henderson case, uploaded years earlier as part of a true crime cold case database. The serial number matched. Daniel's heart began to pound. He immediately went down a rabbit hole, reading everything he could find about the Henderson disappearance. The newspaper articles from 1971, the true crime books, the online forums. The more he read, the more obsessed he became. This camera in his possession had been at the center of one of America's greatest mysteries. It had been in that dining room, had photographed that family in their final moments. What had it captured? 3 weeks later, he received the email. You need to see this. Attached were digital scans of the recovered images. The first several frames were ordinary family photos. The Hendersons at a park in early October. Tommy's 12th birthday party with a chocolate cake and 12 candles. Baby Emma's baptism, Margaret holding her in a white gown. Sarah with her arms around her father, both of them grinning. Daniel studied these images with fascination. These people, frozen in time, smiling and happy, had no idea what was coming. It was like looking at ghosts. Beautiful, tragic ghosts. Then came the final 2 frames. Both taken on October 17, 1971, based on the date stamp Robert had faithfully maintained on the camera. Frame 23 showed exactly what you'd expect. The Henderson family at their dining room table. Robert seated at the head. Margaret mid-step from the kitchen, holding the roasting pan. Sarah and Tommy in their seats. Emma in her high chair. Everyone smiling for the camera. A perfect, ordinary moment. Daniel stared at this photo for a long time. This was it. The last moment they were all alive and together and safe. The last moment before everything changed. He could see the happiness in their faces. The love. The ordinary beauty of a family sharing dinner on a Sunday evening. Frame 24 was different. The family was still there, still in their positions. But now, in the background, the door to the basement was open. And standing in that doorway, partially obscured by the angle and the dim lighting, was a man. He was wearing dark coveralls, the kind a utility worker might wear. His build suggested someone in their 30s or 40s, approximately 5'10", medium build. His face was turned slightly away from the camera, but you could see his profile. Strong jaw, short hair, He appeared to be looking toward the dining room, toward the family, though none of them were looking at him. They were all still focused on the camera, waiting for the timer to click. This man, this stranger, had been in the Henderson house, in the basement, while the family sat down to dinner, and none of them knew he was there. Daniel stared at this photograph for a long time before he called the police. His hands were shaking. His mind was racing. He'd found something that had been hidden for 52 years. Something that might finally explain what happened to the Henderson family. He called the Millbrook Police Department, explained who he was, what he'd found. The desk officer was skeptical at first, but something in Daniel's voice must have convinced him. Within an hour, 2 detectives were at Daniel's apartment in Philadelphia, examining the photographs. The Millbrook Police Department, now significantly larger than its 1971 incarnation, took the call seriously. Within hours, the photograph was authenticated. The FBI's forensic image analysis team confirmed it was genuine, not tampered with, actually taken in 1971. The paper, the emulsion, the chemical composition of the development, everything matched. The Henderson case, dormant for decades, was officially reopened. The photograph was revolutionary. For the first time, investigators had a tangible lead. There had been someone else in that house. An intruder. A man who had no business being there. But who was he? Modern technology in 2023 could do things that 1971 technology couldn't dream of. The photograph was enhanced using AI upscaling algorithms. The shadows were lightened. The grain was reduced. Slowly, more details emerged. The coveralls were dark blue, possibly navy. On the left chest, there appeared to be a patch, though it was partially obscured by shadow and motion blur. Enhancement algorithms went to work. Letter by letter, the patch revealed itself. Millbrook UTIL. Millbrook Utilities. The man in the Henderson basement had been wearing a Millbrook Utilities uniform. This was the break investigators needed. They pulled employment records from Millbrook Utilities for 1971. The company had employed 16 people total that year, 12 office staff and administrators, 4 field service workers who actually went to homes for repairs, installations, and meter readings. Of those 4 field workers, 3 were eliminated almost immediately. 2 were in their 60s in 1971, significantly older than the man in the photograph. 1 was only 5'4", much shorter than the figure in the doorway. The 4th field worker was Gerald Pritchard, 34 years old in October 1971, 5'10", medium build, short brown hair. He matched. Investigators pulled everything they could find on Gerald Pritchard. He'd been hired by Millbrook Utilities in April 1969. His employment file noted he was adequate but unmotivated. He was frequently late. He had several customer complaints about his attitude. He was fired in March 1972 for repeated violations of company policy and erratic behavior, though the file didn't specify what that meant. But there was more, much more. And as investigators dug deeper into Gerald Pritchard's life, a pattern emerged. A dark, disturbing pattern. After leaving Millbrook, Pritchard moved to Cleveland, Ohio. In 1974, he was arrested for breaking and entering. Served 6 months. In 1978, he was arrested for aggravated assault after a bar fight. Served 18 months. In 1982, he was arrested for attempted kidnapping. That last arrest is where things get truly chilling. According to Cleveland police reports from January 1982, Gerald Pritchard approached a family's home claiming to be there to check their gas meter. When the father, Mark Simmons, led him into the basement, Pritchard pulled a knife and attempted to force the entire family, mother, father, and 2 young children, into the basement at knife point. The father fought back. Neighbors heard screaming and called police. Pritchard was arrested at the scene. During interrogation, Pritchard made several strange statements. When asked why he targeted the Simmons family, he said they were home. That's all. They were supposed to be gone. When pressed further, he said something that made the interrogating detective's blood run cold. It worked before. It should have worked again. What worked before, Gerald? Pritchard wouldn't elaborate. He was convicted and sentenced to 15 years in prison. He served 13 before dying of lung cancer in 1991. He never confessed to anything beyond the Simmons attempted kidnapping. But now in 2023, investigators had a photograph that placed Gerald Pritchard in the Henderson house on the night they disappeared. The theory began to take shape. October 17, 1971. Millbrook Utilities had a service call scheduled for 40 Maple Street, the home of Lily and David Chun, the Hendersons' next-door neighbors. The appointment was for October 18th, Monday, to check a potential gas leak Mrs. Chun had reported. But Gerald Pritchard got the date wrong. He showed up on October 17th, Sunday, a day early. Mrs. Chun told him to come back the next day. This is documented in her original statement to police, though at the time, no one realized its significance. She'd mentioned a utility worker came by Sunday evening around 6:30, but I told him he had the wrong day. Investigators now believe Pritchard went to the wrong house first. 42 Maple Street instead of 40. The Hendersons instead of the Chens. It was dinner time. The family wouldn't have answered the door. Pritchard, used to utility workers having access to basements, likely went around back. Many homes in that era had external basement access, a separate door or storm cellar entrance. The Henderson house had one. Pritchard entered the basement. Maybe he intended to rob them. Maybe he was just checking to see if anyone was home before he did. But he was down there in the basement while the family sat down to eat dinner. At some point, he came up the basement stairs. The door at the top of those stairs opened into the dining room. He opened it, perhaps just to listen, to see if the coast was clear. And Robert Henderson's camera, set on a timer, captured him there. Frame 24. The stranger in the doorway. What happened next, in the seconds after that photograph was taken, can only be theorized based on evidence. But investigators believe it went something like this. Robert heard the camera click. He stood up to retrieve it from the sideboard. In doing so, he turned and saw the basement door open. Saw Gerald Pritchard standing there. Robert likely shouted. Something like, "Who are you? What are you doing in my house?" Pritchard panicked. He was already on probation for a previous misdemeanor. If he was caught breaking into a home, even claiming he was there for work, he'd go to prison. He'd lose his job. His life would be over. And so, he made a terrible decision. The basement in the Henderson house had been built in the 1920s. Dirt floor. Stone foundation walls. An old coal furnace that had been converted to gas heating in the 1950s. It was dark, damp, and most importantly, it had a lot of loose dirt. Investigators believe Pritchard forced the family into the basement at knife point or possibly with a weapon he found in the house. The house would have had a knife block in the kitchen. All he needed was to grab one person, probably Margaret or one of the children, and threaten harm unless the others complied. The family would have been terrified. Emma probably crying. Margaret begging for her children's lives. Robert trying to negotiate, to reason with this man. Sarah holding Tommy, both of them shaking with fear. Once in the basement, he killed them. Probably quickly, probably brutally. Then he buried them in the dirt floor under the old coal furnace area, where the ground was already disturbed and excavated. He cleaned up as best he could, closed the basement door, turned on lights throughout the house to make it look lived in, locked the back door on his way out. Then he went home and went to work the next day as if nothing had happened. For 52 years, this was just a theory. A horrifying, plausible theory, but still just speculation. Gerald Pritchard was dead. He couldn't be interrogated. He couldn't confess. The photograph placed him in the house, but it didn't prove he'd killed anyone. Until the excavation. In March 2024, the current owners of 42 Maple Street, a couple named Brian and Jennifer Walsh, agreed to allow a forensic team to excavate their basement. Ground-penetrating radar had indicated anomalies in the soil beneath the old furnace area. The Walshes, horrified to learn their home's history, wanted closure as much as anyone. The excavation took 3 days. It was painstaking work. Forensic anthropologists worked carefully, sifting through dirt, documenting every find, preserving evidence. News crews gathered outside. The story had captured national attention again. 52 years after they vanished, the Henderson family was headline news once more. On the afternoon of March 14, 2024, 52 years and 5 months after they vanished, the remains of Robert Henderson, Margaret Henderson, Sarah Henderson, Tommy Henderson, and 8-month-old Emma Henderson were recovered from the basement of their own home. They had never left. DNA analysis confirmed their identities. Forensic anthropologists determined they'd been killed by blunt force trauma and stab wounds. The violence had been extreme. Pritchard had made sure none of them survived. They'd been there all along, for 52 years. While police searched the town, while bloodhounds tracked scents that went nowhere, while the nation wondered what happened to the vanishing family, they'd been 15 feet below where investigators stood. Pritchard had buried them, closed the basement door, and disappeared into his life. He worked at Millbrook Utilities for 5 more months before being fired. He moved to Ohio. He went on to commit other crimes, escalating in violence, until he finally made a mistake in 1982 and was caught. And even then, even sitting in an interrogation room with a detective asking what worked before, he never confessed. He took the secret to his grave. Except he didn't account for one thing. Robert Henderson's camera, set on a timer, advancing to frame 24 at precisely the moment Pritchard opened that basement door. Capturing his image, preserving it in silver halide crystals for 5 decades, waiting for technology to advance, waiting for someone to find it, waiting for the truth to emerge. The Henderson family was given a proper burial on May 3, 2024. Hundreds of people attended, many who never knew them but felt connected to their story. Lily Chun, now 94 years old and the only person still alive who'd been close to the family, laid flowers on each casket. She wept for her neighbors, for Sarah's friendship with her daughter, for all the years of not knowing. Julie Chun, now 68 years old, attended with her own grown children. She'd never forgotten that last phone call. See you at school tomorrow. She'd spent her entire life wondering what happened to her best friend. Now she finally knew. The knowing didn't make it hurt less, but at least the questions were answered. The case was officially closed. Gerald Pritchard was posthumously charged with 5 counts of first-degree murder. Daniel Torres donated the camera to the National Museum of Crime and Justice, where it sits in a display case with a placard explaining its role in solving one of Pennsylvania's most haunting mysteries. The house on Maple Street stands quiet now. The Walshes moved out. They couldn't live there anymore. It's up for sale again. History repeating itself. The real estate listing doesn't mention what happened there. Perhaps the next owners won't know. Perhaps they'll raise their own family in that house, make new memories, fill those rooms with laughter and love. Perhaps that's what the Hendersons would have wanted. And somewhere in the archives of the Millbrook Police Department, in a box that will likely never be opened again, sits frame 23 of Robert Henderson's film. The photograph taken 10 seconds before everything went wrong. A family smiling at a camera. A father who loved photography. A mother bringing dinner to the table. Children who had their whole lives ahead of them. A baby who would never say her first word. One photograph of happiness. And one photograph of a monster in the doorway, captured accidentally. Held in darkness for 52 years until light finally revealed him. This is what haunts me about the Henderson case. Not just the brutality of what Gerald Pritchard did, though that's horrifying enough, but the randomness of it, the pure, senseless chance. If Pritchard had shown up to the correct house, the Chens, who weren't home, nothing would have happened. If he'd gotten the date right and come on Monday instead of Sunday, the Hendersons would have lived. If Robert hadn't decided to take a family photo that night, Pritchard would never have been captured on film, and this case might never have been solved. 5 people died because a utility worker got an address wrong and showed up a day early. 5 people died, and the truth stayed buried until a 28-year-old camera collector spent $15 at an estate sale. The Henderson family never got to eat that pot roast. Sarah never became a journalist. Tommy never played another baseball game. Emma never grew up. Robert and Margaret never got to see their children's futures. But 52 years later, Because of a photograph taken by accident, captured by a timer, preserved in the darkness of an undeveloped film, they got something else. They got the truth. They got justice. And they got to come home. If this story affected you the way it affected me, if you believe that truth, no matter how long buried, deserves to see the light, then you need to subscribe to Ultimate Crime Stories. We don't just tell you about crimes. We take you deep into the investigations. We show you how cases are solved. We honor the victims by telling their complete stories with respect and meticulous research. We have dozens more cases like this one, mysteries that seemed unsolvable until that one crucial piece of evidence emerged. Stories that will keep you thinking long after the video ends. Hit that subscribe button right now and join the thousands of people who trust us to bring them the most compelling true crime content on YouTube. Turn on notifications so you never miss a new case. And if you want to support this channel and help us continue investigating and presenting these important stories, consider becoming a member. Your support allows us to spend the time necessary to do these stories justice. Thank you for watching. The Henderson family story is finally complete, but there are so many more stories waiting to be told. Stories of mysteries, of investigations, of truth emerging from darkness. And we'll be here telling them one case at a time. Until next time, this is Ultimate Crime Stories.